The morning sun painted the Texas sky in shades of copper and gold as Thomas McKenna crested the rocky ridge overlooking the Double Bar Ranch. His horse, a sturdy bay gelding named Thunder, snorted and stamped beneath him, sensing his rider's tension. Thomas pulled the reins tight, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he surveyed the valley below. 3 days of hard riding had brought him here, but the sound of hoof beats echoing from the canyon behind told him his pursuers were closing in fast. Thomas had never imagined his life would come to this. Just a week ago, he had been the respected foreman of the Circle M Ranch, trusted by Old Man Morrison and respected by every cowhand from here to Amarillo. Now he was a wanted man with a bounty on his head and nowhere left to run. The charges were trumped up, he knew that much. Someone had planted stolen cattle on his property and made sure Sheriff Dalton found them there. But proving his innocence seemed impossible when half the county believed he had turned rustler. The valley spread out below him like a green carpet dotted with grazing cattle. The ranch buildings clustered around a main house that looked well-maintained and prosperous. What caught his attention most, however, were the long lines of rope strung between wooden posts near the bunkhouse. Sheets, shirts, and various garments fluttered in the morning breeze like colorful flags. More importantly, he could see several figures moving between the lines, hanging up freshly washed clothes. Even from this distance, it was clear they were women. Thomas had heard stories about the Double Bar Ranch. Old Pete Garrison had died 3 years back, leaving the place to his daughter Sarah. Most folks figured she would sell it quick and move back east where proper ladies belonged. Instead, she had surprised everyone by hiring an all-female crew to work the ranch. Some called it scandalous, others called it foolish. But Thomas had heard the Double Bar was turning a better profit than most spreads twice its size. Thunder shifted restlessly beneath him as the sound of approaching riders grew louder. Thomas counted at least 6 horses. Maybe more. Sheriff Dalton would be leading them, along with his deputy Curtis and probably a few hired guns from town. They had been tracking him for 3 days straight, and their horses were likely just as tired as his. But they had numbers on their side, and Thomas was running out of places to hide. He urged Thunder down the slope toward the ranch, keeping to the cover of scrub oak and mesquite where possible. The clotheslines offered the only concealment large enough to hide both him and his horse. If he could reach them without being spotted, maybe he could blend in long enough for the posse to ride past. It was a desperate plan, but desperate times called for desperate measures. As he drew closer, Thomas could make out the women working among the hanging clothes more clearly. There were 5 of them, ranging in age from barely 20 to perhaps 40. They wore practical work clothes, split riding skirts and sturdy boots, with their hair tied back under wide-brimmed hats. They moved with the easy confidence of people comfortable with hard work and open spaces. One of them, a tall woman with auburn hair visible beneath her hat brim, seemed to be directing the others. Thomas guided Thunder into a grove of cottonwoods at the edge of the hanging area and dismounted quickly. He could hear the posse cresting the ridge behind him now, their voices carrying on the morning air. There was no time for proper introductions or explanations. He grabbed Thunder's reins and led the horse deeper into the maze of hanging laundry, hoping the fluttering fabric would break up their outline enough to provide concealment. The tall woman with auburn hair noticed him first. She straightened from the wash basin where she had been wringing out a shirt and fixed him with a steady gaze that missed nothing. Thomas touched the brim of his hat politely, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Morning, ladies," he said quietly, trying to keep his voice calm. "I don't mean to impose, but I'm in a spot of trouble and could use a place to lay low for a spell." The woman studied him for a long moment, taking in his dusty clothes, tired horse, and the way he kept glancing toward the ridge. The other women had stopped their work now and were watching the exchange with interest. Thomas noticed that each of them wore a gun belt, and their hands rested casually near their weapons. "What kind of trouble?" the auburn-haired woman asked. Her voice carried the authority of someone used to being in charge. "The kind that involves Sheriff Dalton and a posse of armed men who think I'm something I'm not," Thomas replied honestly. "I'm not asking you to fight my battles, just hoping you might not mind if I water my horse at your trough while they ride past." The woman glanced at her companions, some silent communication passing between them. Thomas could hear the hoofbeats getting closer now, echoing off the valley walls. In another few minutes, the posse would have a clear view of the ranch buildings. "Sarah Garrison," the woman said, extending her hand. "This is my ranch, and these are my hands. What's your name? And what exactly are you accused of?" "Thomas McKenna," he replied, shaking her firm grip. "Used to be foreman over at the Circle M until someone decided to frame me for rustling. Found a dozen head of branded cattle on my property that I never put there, and Sheriff Dalton was real eager to believe I was guilty." Sarah's expression hardened. "Circle M cattle?" "Morrison's prize Herefords. Someone drove them onto my land in the middle of the night and made an anonymous tip to the sheriff. By the time I woke up, they were grazing in my back pasture, bold as you please." One of the younger women, a blonde with sharp blue eyes, spat into the dirt. "Sounds like Morrison's handiwork to me. He's been trying to squeeze out the small ranchers for months." Sarah nodded grimly. "Jake Morrison's been eyeing this valley for years. Wouldn't put it past him to frame an honest man to clear out the competition." She looked back at Thomas. "Hide your horse behind the laundry. Girls, keep working like nothing's wrong. If anyone asks, we haven't seen anybody all morning." Thomas felt a surge of relief as he led Thunder deeper into the forest of hanging clothes. The horse seemed to understand the need for quiet and stood perfectly still as Thomas positioned them behind a particularly large sheet. Through gaps in the fabric, he could see the ranch yard and the approaching dust cloud that marked the posse's arrival. Sheriff Dalton rode into the yard with 5 men behind him, their horses lathered from hard travel. Dalton was a big man with a drooping mustache and cold eyes that seemed to suspect everyone of something. His deputy, Curtis, was younger but just as hard-looking. The other 3 were hired guns Thomas recognized from the saloons in town, the kind of men who would shoot first and ask questions later if the price was right. "Morning, Miss Garrison," Dalton called out, touching his hat brim in a gesture that somehow managed to seem mocking. "We're tracking a dangerous fugitive, and his trail leads right through your valley." "You seen anything unusual this morning?" Sarah continued hanging clothes as if the arrival of 6 armed men was nothing more than a minor interruption. "Nothing unusual, Sheriff. Just doing the washing like we do every Monday." Curtis rode closer, his hand resting on his gun butt. "We're looking for Thomas McKenna. Tall fellow, dark hair, riding a bay horse. He's wanted for cattle rustling, and we have reason to believe he came this way." The blonde woman, whose name Thomas still didn't know, looked up from her work with an expression of mild curiosity. "Cattle rustling? That's a serious charge. What did he steal?" "Dozen head of Morrison's prize breeding stock," Dalton replied. "Caught red-handed with them on his property. Now he's running scared, and we aim to bring him back to face justice." Sarah straightened and fixed the sheriff with a level stare. "Justice, Sheriff? Or just whatever Jake Morrison's paying you to call justice these days?" Dalton's face darkened. "That's a serious accusation, Miss Garrison. I'd be careful about spreading such talk if I were you. And I'd be careful about taking Jake Morrison's word as gospel if I were you," Sarah shot back. "But to answer your question, we haven't seen hide nor hair of any fugitives, just us working women trying to earn an honest living." Thomas held his breath as one of the hired guns dismounted and walked toward the clotheslines. The man's hand rested on his pistol grip, and his eyes swept back and forth across the hanging garments. Thomas pressed himself against Thunder's flank, trusting the horse to remain calm and quiet. The gunman stopped just a few feet away from where Thomas hid, his head turning as he listened for any sound out of place. Through a gap in the sheets, Thomas could see the man's profile. His name was Jake Slade, and he had a reputation as a killer. If Slade found him here, there would be gunplay for certain. "Lot of laundry for 5 women," Slade commented, reaching out to push aside a hanging shirt. "We wash for some of the other small ranchers, too," the blonde woman replied smoothly. "Helps bring in extra money. You know how hard it is to make ends meet these days." Slade grunted and continued his inspection, moving methodically through the hanging clothes. Thomas could hear Thunder's breathing and prayed the horse wouldn't choose this moment to whinny or stamp. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the morning coolness. "Slade," Dalton called out, "leave the ladies' laundry alone. If McKenna was here, we'd have seen his horse by now." Reluctantly, Slade stepped back from the clothes lines and returned to his mount. "Trail leads right through here, Sheriff. If he didn't stop, he's got to be in the hills beyond." "Then that's where we'll look," Dalton replied. He turned back to Sarah. "Miss Garrison, if McKenna shows up here, you send word to town immediately. He's dangerous, and we don't want any innocent folks getting hurt." Sarah's expression remained neutral. "Of course, Sheriff. We'll be sure to let you know if we see anything suspicious." Dalton nodded curtly and wheeled his horse around. The posse rode out of the yard at a gallop, heading for the hills on the far side of the valley. Thomas remained hidden until the sound of hoofbeats faded completely into the distance. When Sarah finally gave the all-clear, Thomas emerged from his hiding spot with Thunder in tow. His legs felt shaky with relief, and he had to lean against the horse for a moment to steady himself. "Thank you," he said simply. "I know you ladies took a risk helping me." "No risk," said the blonde woman, finally introducing herself. "I'm Kate Williams, and anybody who's got Jake Morrison stirred up enough to send hired guns after them is probably on the right side of things." The other women gathered around, and Thomas found himself being introduced to Maria Santos, a compact woman with intelligent dark eyes; Ellen Parker, barely out of her teens but with the steady gaze of someone much older; and Ruth Thompson, the oldest of the group with streaks of gray in her brown hair and hands that spoke of decades of hard work. "We've all had run-ins with Morrison and his crowd," Ruth explained. "He's been trying to buy out or drive out every small rancher in 3 counties. Those of us who won't sell seem to have accidents or find ourselves facing trumped-up charges." Sarah nodded grimly. 3 of our neighbors have sold out in the past 6 months after mysterious cattle disappearances and water rights disputes. Morrison always shows up a few days later with an offer to buy their land for half what it's worth. Thomas felt a growing anger at the injustice of it all. He had suspected Morrison was behind his troubles, but hearing these women confirm his suspicions made it real. "How does he get away with it? What about the law?" Kate snorted. "Sheriff Dalton's been in Morrison's pocket for years. Half the town council, too. Morrison owns the bank, the general store, and most of the businesses in town. People are too scared or too dependent on him to speak up. But not all of us," Ellen added quietly. "There are still some folks with backbone left in this county. The question is, what are we going to do about it?" Thomas looked around at the 5 determined faces surrounding him. These women had risked their safety to help a stranger, and they were clearly not intimidated by Morrison's threats. An idea began to form in his mind, dangerous but potentially effective. "Ladies, I appreciate everything you've done for me already, but I have a proposition. Instead of just running and hiding, what if we turned the tables on Morrison? What if we found a way to expose what he's really doing?" Sarah raised an eyebrow. "That's a tall order, McKenna. Morrison's got most of the county sewn up tight. How exactly do you propose we go about proving he's behind all this?" Thomas grinned for the first time in days. "Well, for starters, we know he had to have inside help to move those cattle onto my property without anyone seeing. And people who do dirty work for money tend to get nervous when things go wrong. Maybe it's time we rattled some cages and see what falls out." The women exchanged glances, and Thomas could see the idea taking hold in their minds. These weren't ordinary ranch women content to hide behind their laundry lines. They were fighters, and they were tired of running from Morrison's intimidation. As the sun climbed higher into the Texas sky, Thomas McKenna found himself part of something he hadn't expected when he rode into the valley that morning. He had come looking for a place to hide, but instead he had found allies. The question now was whether their combined courage and determination would be enough to take on Jake Morrison and his corrupt network before the sheriff and his hired guns returned to finish what they had started. 2 days had passed since Thomas McKenna first sought refuge among the clotheslines of the Double Bar Ranch. During that time, he had learned more about Jake Morrison's operations than he had discovered in months of suspicious wondering. The women of the Double Bar were not just skilled ranch hands, they were natural investigators who had been quietly gathering information about Morrison's activities for over a year. Ruth Thompson spread a hand-drawn map across the kitchen table in the ranch house, pointing to various markings with a weathered finger. "Morrison's been buying up land through dummy companies," she explained. "Uses different names, but the money all traces back to his bank. Here, here, and here." She indicated several spots on the map. "He's acquired properties right after the owners faced mysterious troubles." Thomas studied the pattern, feeling his anger grow with each revelation. The Wilson place, the Rodriguez ranch, old Pete Martinez's spread. "I remember when they all sold out. Thought it was just bad luck hitting all at once." "No such thing as that much bad luck," Maria Santos said grimly. She had ridden in from town that morning with fresh intelligence. "I talked to my cousin who works at the telegraph office. Morrison's been sending messages to cattle buyers in Kansas City, promising delivery of prime breeding stock next month. More cattle than he could legally own, unless he's planning to acquire more herds real soon." Kate Williams looked up from cleaning her rifle, a practical task that had become routine since Thomas's arrival. "Which means he's not done framing folks for rustling. You might have been just the first, Thomas." Sarah Garrison paced the length of the kitchen, her boots clicking against the wooden floor. As the leader of this unconventional outfit, she carried the weight of decisions that could affect them all. "We need proof that will stand up even against Morrison's influence. Suspicions and connections aren't enough if we're going to the territorial authorities." Ellen Parker, who despite her youth had proven to have a sharp mind for details, spread out several sheets of paper covered with neat handwriting. "I've been tracking the cattle movements Morrison's reported to the Territorial Registry against what people have actually seen. The numbers don't add up. He's claiming ownership of nearly twice as many head as he could have bred naturally." Thomas leaned back in his chair, impressed by the thoroughness of their investigation. "You ladies have been busy, but we're still missing the key piece. We need to catch Morrison or his men in the act of moving stolen cattle. Or find where he's keeping them before he ships them north," Ruth added. "Cattle don't just disappear. They have to be somewhere." Sarah stopped pacing and fixed Thomas with a determined look. "That's where you come in. You know cattle better than any of us, and you know Morrison's operation. If anyone can figure out where he's hiding stolen stock, it's you." Thomas felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. These women had already risked everything to help him, and now they were asking him to lead them deeper into danger. But the alternative was letting Morrison continue his campaign of theft and intimidation until he owned the entire county. "There's an old line shack about 15 miles north of Morrison's main ranch," Thomas said slowly, thinking through the geography of the area. "It's in a box canyon with good grass and water, but hidden from the main trails. Morrison's father used to winter cattle there before they built the big ranch. If I was hiding stolen stock, that's where I'd put them." Kate checked the action on her rifle and nodded approvingly. "Sounds like a good place to start looking. When do we ride?" "We?" Thomas raised an eyebrow. "This is dangerous work. If Morrison's men catch us snooping around, they'll be shooting for sure." The 5 women exchanged glances, and Thomas saw amusement mixed with determination in their expressions. Ruth chuckled. Son, we've been dealing with dangerous men since before you rode into our valley. Don't you worry about our ability to handle ourselves." Maria stood and adjusted her gun belt. "Besides, you'll need someone to hold the horses while you examine the cattle, and someone to watch the back trail in case company shows up unexpected." Sarah nodded decisively. "We ride at sunset. If there are stolen cattle in that canyon, they'll be settled for the night, and we'll have moonlight to see by. Ellen stays here to watch the ranch and send word if Dalton shows up again." Ellen looked disappointed but didn't argue. Someone had to maintain their cover, and the youngest member of the group was the logical choice for the safer assignment. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Thomas found himself checking his weapons and supplies alongside 4 of the most capable women he had ever met. Each of them moved with the quiet efficiency of experienced riders preparing for a dangerous mission. There was no nervous chatter or last-minute doubts, just the steady preparation of people who knew their business. Thunder seemed eager for action after 2 days of rest and good feed. The horse had bonded quickly with the ranch's other mounts, and Thomas suspected the intelligent animal understood that these people were friends. As he adjusted the stirrups and checked the cinch, he caught Sarah watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Second thoughts?" she asked quietly. "About a dozen of them," Thomas replied honestly. "But not about the rightness of what we're doing. Morrison's been getting away with theft and intimidation for too long. It's time somebody stood up to him. Even if it costs you your life?" Thomas considered the question seriously. "I was dead anyway if I kept running. At least this way, if something happens to me, you ladies have the information you need to finish what we started." Sarah smiled, and Thomas felt something warm settle in his chest. "Nothing's going to happen to you, Thomas McKenna. We didn't save you from Dalton's posse just to let Morrison's men shoot you in some canyon." The ride to the hidden canyon took 3 hours, following deer trails and dry washes to avoid the main roads where they might encounter other travelers. Ruth proved to be an excellent tracker, reading sign in the moonlight that Thomas could barely make out. The older woman had grown up in this country before the big ranches carved it up, and she knew every hidden path and secret way. They approached the canyon mouth cautiously, dismounting while still a quarter-mile away to minimize the chance of their horses betraying their presence. Thomas could smell cattle on the night wind, the distinctive odor of a large herd bedded down for the night. His pulse quickened as they crept closer to the canyon rim. What they found exceeded even Thomas's suspicions. The hidden valley contained at least 50 head of prime cattle, far more than Morrison could legally claim. More importantly, Thomas recognized several distinctive brands among the animals below. "That's Circle M stock," he whispered to Sarah, pointing to a group of Herefords near the small stream that ran through the canyon floor. "And those Longhorns belong to the Martinez family. Old Pete sold out 3 months ago, but he sure didn't sell to Morrison." Kate had positioned herself where she could watch the approach trails, her rifle ready across her knees. "2 guards by the line shack," she reported quietly. "Looks like they're settling in for the night." Maria crept back from a scouting position near the canyon entrance. "Fresh tracks leading out toward the railroad. Looks like they've been moving cattle regular-like, probably shipping them north in small groups to avoid suspicion." Thomas felt a surge of satisfaction. This was exactly the proof they needed to expose Morrison's operation. "We need to get closer, get an accurate count and identify as many brands as possible. If we can document what's down there, even Morrison's pet sheriff will have trouble explaining it away." Sarah nodded and began organizing their approach. "Ruth and I will work our way down the north wall, get a count of the stock near the water. Maria, you and Thomas take the south side. See if you can get close enough to read brands. Kate keeps watch and signals if trouble comes." The descent into the canyon was treacherous work in the moonlight, requiring careful placement of every step to avoid dislodging loose stones that might alert the guards. Thomas found himself admiring the skill and courage of his companions as they navigated the rocky slopes like mountain goats. These women had clearly done dangerous work before. Thomas and Maria reached the canyon floor without incident and began working their way among the sleeping cattle. The animals were used to human presence and barely stirred as the two investigators moved between them. Thomas kept a running count while Maria sketched brand marks in a small notebook she had brought for the purpose. The evidence was overwhelming. Thomas identified cattle belonging to at least 6 different ranchers, all of whom had supposedly sold out or lost their stock to rustlers in recent months. The animals were in excellent condition, well fed and cared for, suggesting they had been here for some time rather than being moved through quickly. A low whistle from Kate's position warned that someone was coming. Thomas grabbed Maria's arm, and they quickly took cover behind a large boulder near the stream. Through the gaps in the rock, Thomas could see 2 riders approaching the line shack, their voices carrying clearly in the still night air. "Boss wants these cattle moved tomorrow night," one of the riders was saying. "Railroad cars waiting in Millerville and the buyers getting impatient." The second rider dismounted near the shack and began unsaddling his horse. "About time. We've been sitting on this stock too long. Makes me nervous having all this evidence in one place." Thomas felt his blood run cold. If Morrison was planning to move the cattle tomorrow night, this might be their only chance to gather proof. But it also meant the danger had just increased dramatically. The first rider, whom Thomas now recognized as one of Morrison's regular hands, continued talking as he tended to his horse. "Morrison's got word that McKenna's still in the area. Sheriff's gonna organize another search tomorrow. Sweep the whole valley this time." "Good riddance when they catch him," the second man replied. "Boss says McKenna's been asking too many questions for his own good. Better to have him swing for rustling than risk him figuring out what's really going on." Maria pressed close to Thomas, her eyes wide with alarm. If Morrison was planning another sweep tomorrow, their time was running out fast. They needed to finish gathering evidence and get back to the ranch before dawn. The 2 guards settled down for the night, but their presence made further investigation impossible. Thomas and Maria carefully withdrew from their position and began the difficult climb back up the canyon wall. Every loose pebble sounded impossibly loud, and Thomas expected shouts of alarm at any moment. They regrouped at the horses without incident, but the mood was grim as they prepared for the ride home. The evidence they had gathered was damning, but Morrison was clearly preparing to destroy it by moving the cattle. They needed a new plan, and they needed it fast. "We can't stop him from moving the cattle," Sarah said as they rode through the moonlit hills. "But we can make sure someone besides us knows about this canyon. If we can get word to the territorial marshal, maybe he can intercept Morrison's shipment." Thomas shook his head. "The nearest territorial office is 2 days' ride from here. By the time we could get word there and back, those cattle will be halfway to Kansas." Ruth had been riding silently, deep in thought. What if we don't try to stop the cattle from moving? What if we follow them instead and catch Morrison red-handed with stolen stock? The idea had merit, but it was desperately dangerous. Following a herd of 50 cattle with armed guards would require careful planning and no small amount of luck. If they were discovered, Morrison's men would shoot first and ask questions later. "It's risky," Kate said, voicing what they all knew. "But it might be our only chance to get proof that will stick." Thomas looked around at the determined faces of his companions and felt a mixture of pride and fear. These women were willing to risk everything to see justice done, but the responsibility for their safety weighed heavily on his shoulders. As they approached the ranch, Thomas could see the warm glow of lamplight in the kitchen windows, where Ellen waited for their return. Soon they would have to make the most important decision of their lives, one that could either free them all from Morrison's tyranny or get them killed in the attempt. The clotheslines where Thomas had first hidden still fluttered in the night breeze, a reminder of how much had changed since that desperate morning when he first sought refuge among these remarkable women. Tomorrow would bring new dangers and difficult choices, but tonight they were still free and still fighting back. As thunder carried him toward the barn, Thomas found himself hoping that their courage and determination would be enough for what lay ahead. The pre-dawn darkness hung heavy over the Double Bar Ranch as Thomas McKenna and the four women made their final preparations. They had spent most of the night planning their dangerous mission to follow Morrison's stolen cattle to the railroad and catch his operation red-handed. Ellen Parker had volunteered to ride to the territorial capital with a message for the marshal, but it would take her 2 days to reach Santa Fe and another day for help to arrive. By then, the evidence would be gone, and Morrison would have covered his tracks once again. Sarah Garrison checked her saddlebags one final time, ensuring she had enough ammunition and supplies for what could be a long pursuit. "Remember, we're not looking for a fight," she reminded the group. "Our job is to gather evidence and witnesses. If we can get one of Morrison's men to talk, or catch them loading stolen cattle into railroad cars, that's all the proof we need." Ruth Thompson nodded grimly as she adjusted her rifle scabbard. "And if they decide to fight anyway?" "Then we defend ourselves," Kate Williams replied, her voice steady and determined. "But we don't start anything we don't have to finish." Thomas felt the familiar weight of responsibility as he swung into Thunder's saddle. These women were risking everything based on his word that Morrison was planning to move the cattle today. If he was wrong, they would have wasted precious time that could have been used to find another way to expose the rustling operation. Maria Santos mounted her paint horse with practiced ease. "Thomas, you know this country better than any of us. What's the most likely route Morrison will use to get those cattle to the railroad?" Thomas had been thinking about that question all night. "There are 3 ways to reach Millerville from that canyon. The main road is fastest but too public. The north trail through Devil's Canyon is shorter but harder on the cattle. My guess is they'll take the old freight road that runs along Willow Creek. It's longer, but it keeps them away from prying eyes." Sarah nodded decisively. "Then that's where we'll intercept them. We can set up observation posts along the route and track them to wherever they're loading the cattle." The 5 riders set out as the first gray light of dawn touched the eastern horizon. They rode hard for the first hour, wanting to reach the freight road before Morrison's men could pass their position. The stolen cattle would move slowly, but they had a significant head start, and there was no room for error. The old freight road had once been the main route between the territorial capital and the eastern markets, but the railroad had made it largely obsolete. Now it was little more than a pair of wagon ruts winding through mesquite and sagebrush, perfect for someone who wanted to move stolen goods without being observed. Ruth proved her worth once again by finding fresh cattle tracks pressed into the soft earth near a creek crossing. "Big herd," she reported, kneeling beside the clearest hoof prints. "Maybe 50 head, moving steady but not hurried. 4, maybe 5 riders with them." Thomas examined the tracks and felt his pulse quicken. "That's them. These prints are maybe 2 hours old, so we're closer than I hoped. We need to be extra careful now." They followed the trail at a distance, always keeping at least one bend of the road between themselves and their quarry. The terrain worked in their favor, offering plenty of cover among the rolling hills and scattered groves of oak and mesquite. When they reached higher ground, they could occasionally glimpse dust clouds in the distance, marking the progress of the stolen herd. By midday, the trail had led them within 5 miles of Millerville. Thomas could see smoke from the town's chimneys rising into the clear blue sky, and the distant whistle of a locomotive told him they were running out of time. If Morrison's men reached the railroad loading pens, it would be almost impossible to prove the cattle were stolen once they were loaded onto cars and mixed with legitimate shipments. Kate had dismounted and crawled to the edge of a rocky outcrop to observe the road below. She returned with news that made Thomas's heart race. "They're stopped at Miller's waterhole, resting the cattle. Looks like they're waiting for something." Sarah crept forward to take her own look at the situation. When she returned, her expression was grim. "There are 6 riders with the herd now, and I recognized 2 of them. Jake Slade and Red McKinnon, both hired killers from Morrison's payroll. This is bigger than just rustling. Morrison's brought in serious gunfighters." Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. Slade alone was dangerous enough, but Red McKinnon had a reputation as one of the deadliest men in 3 territories. If Morrison had hired both of them, he was clearly planning something more permanent than just shipping stolen cattle. "Maybe they're waiting for dark to reach the railroad," Maria suggested. "Easier to load cattle without curious eyes watching." Ruth shook her head. "Or maybe they're waiting for someone else, someone important enough to bring in professional killers to protect." The answer came 20 minutes later when a lone rider approached the waterhole from the direction of Millerville. Even at a distance, Thomas recognized the distinctive black suit and silver-trimmed hat of Jake Morrison himself. The cattle baron had come to personally oversee this shipment, which meant it was more important than just another batch of stolen livestock. Thomas crawled forward to get a better view, his spyglass revealing details that made his blood run cold. Morrison was not alone. Sheriff Dalton rode beside him, along with 2 more men Thomas didn't recognize but who had the look of federal marshals about them. If Morrison had somehow convinced territorial authorities to witness the shipment, it would give his operation an official stamp of approval that would be almost impossible to challenge. "We need to get closer," Thomas whispered to Sarah. "If Morrison's got federal witnesses, we need to hear what story he's telling them." Sarah studied the terrain between their position and the waterhole. "Too open. They'd spot us long before we could get close enough to hear anything useful." Kate had an idea that was both brilliant and terrifying. What if they didn't spot all of us? What if one person created a distraction while the others got into position? "Too dangerous," Thomas said immediately. "If Morrison's men catch whoever plays decoy, they'll shoot first and ask questions later." "Not if the decoy is someone they can't afford to shoot," Ruth said quietly. "Someone whose death would bring too much attention." The older woman's meaning became clear as she continued. "Morrison's been trying to buy out every small rancher in the county. What if one of those ranchers showed up here by accident, just passing through with no idea what she was stumbling into?" Sarah's eyes widened as she understood what Ruth was proposing. "You want to ride down there alone and pretend you don't know what's happening?" "I want to ride down there and water my horse like any traveler would," Ruth replied calmly. "While I'm asking innocent questions about their nice herd of cattle, you folks work your way around behind them and listen to what Morrison tells those federal men." It was dangerous beyond measure, but it was also their best chance to gather the evidence they needed. If Ruth could keep Morrison's attention focused on her while the others got into position, they might finally get the proof they needed to expose the entire operation. Thomas felt sick at the thought of putting Ruth in such danger, but he also knew she was right. It was their only chance and time was running out. "If things go bad down there, you run," he told her. "Don't try to be a hero. Just get clear and let us handle the rest." Ruth smiled and patted the stock of her rifle. "Don't worry about me, son. I've been dealing with men like Morrison since before you were born." While Ruth mounted her horse and prepared for her dangerous masquerade, the others planned their approach to the waterhole. The terrain offered decent cover if they were careful, but they would have to split up to get close enough from multiple angles. If shooting started, they needed to be positioned to catch Morrison's men in a crossfire. Thomas took the most dangerous position, working his way along the creek bed until he was within 50 yards of where Morrison stood, talking to the federal officers. Through gaps in the brush, he could see the cattle baron gesticulating toward the herd, while Dalton nodded agreement with whatever story he was spinning. Ruth rode into the waterhole clearing just as Thomas reached his position. She approached the group with the casual confidence of someone who belonged there, touching her hat brim politely as she dismounted. "Afternoon, gentlemen," she said in a voice that carried clearly across the water. "Mind if I water my horse? It's been a long, dusty ride from town." Morrison's face showed surprise and annoyance, but the presence of the federal officers forced him to maintain a facade of politeness. "Of course, ma'am. Always happy to help a fellow traveler." One of the federal men, a distinguished-looking gentleman with a badge visible on his vest, stepped forward. "I'm Deputy Marshal Crawford, ma'am. Are you traveling alone? These roads can be dangerous for unescorted ladies." Ruth smiled sweetly. "Just heading home to my ranch, Marshal. Though I have to say, this is quite a herd you gentlemen have here. Fine-looking cattle. Are you moving them to market?" Morrison's jaw tightened, but he maintained his composure. "Just some stock I'm shipping north. Nothing special." Thomas strained to hear as Crawford continued the conversation. "Mr. Morrison here has been telling us about the rustling problems in this area. Says he's lost considerable stock to thieves operating out of the hills." "That's right," Morrison replied smoothly. "Why, just last week we recovered this entire herd from a gang of rustlers. Sheriff Dalton can vouch for the investigation." Dalton nodded vigorously. "Terrible business, Marshal. Found these cattle in a hidden canyon along with evidence pointing to Thomas McKenna as the leader of the rustling operation." Ruth's expression remained innocently curious, but Thomas could see the tension in her shoulders. "Thomas McKenna? That's awful. I heard he was a respected rancher." "Appearances can be deceiving," Morrison said coldly. "The man was running a sophisticated operation, stealing cattle from honest ranchers and hiding them in remote locations before shipping them north under false brands." Crawford made notes in a small leather journal. "And you're certain these are the recovered cattle?" "Absolutely," Morrison replied. "Every head accounted for and properly documented. I'm shipping them to buyers who will ask no questions about their previous ownership." Thomas felt his anger rising at Morrison's audacity. The man was openly describing his criminal operation while claiming to be the victim. But he was also providing exactly the kind of confession they needed to prove his guilt. From his position, Thomas could see Sarah and Maria working their way closer from the opposite side of the clearing. Kate had found a spot among the rocks where she could cover the entire area with her rifle if shooting started. Everything was going according to plan until Red McKinnon decided to take a closer look at Ruth's horse. "Nice animal," McKinnon said, running his hand along the horse's flank. "Good breeding. Expensive tack, too. You must do pretty well for a woman rancher." Ruth kept her voice steady, but Thomas could hear the underlying tension. "My late husband left me well provided for." McKinnon's eyes narrowed as he examined the saddle more closely. "This leather work looks familiar. I think I've seen this saddle before." Thomas realized with growing alarm that McKinnon was recognizing equipment from the Double Bar Ranch. The hired killer was putting together pieces that could expose Ruth's connection to the women who had been helping Thomas. "Matter of fact," McKinnon continued, his hand moving to rest on his gun butt, "I think I know exactly where I've seen this saddle. At a certain ranch where we've been looking for a certain fugitive." The pretense collapsed in an instant. McKinnon's gun cleared leather with practiced speed, but Ruth was already moving. She threw herself sideways as the killer's first shot splintered the saddle horn where her back had been a split second before. Thomas rose from his hiding place with his own weapon drawn, putting a bullet through McKinnon's shoulder before the gunfighter could fire again. The clearing erupted in chaos as Morrison's men went for their guns, and the federal officers dove for cover behind a wagon. Sarah and Maria opened fire from their positions, catching Jake Slade in a crossfire that sent him sprawling into the creek. Kate's rifle boomed from the rocks, dropping one of Morrison's hired hands before he could bring his weapon to bear. Sheriff Dalton found himself caught in the middle of a gunfight with no clear idea of which side was which. His confusion turned to shock when he saw Thomas McKenna emerge from the brush with smoking guns, very much alive and clearly not the helpless fugitive he had been chasing. "Drop your weapons!" Marshal Crawford shouted, his own pistol drawn. "Federal officers, everyone drop your weapons now!" The shooting stopped as suddenly as it had begun. McKinnon clutched his wounded shoulder while glaring hatred at Thomas. Slade pulled himself out of the creek, waterlogged and defeated. The remaining hired guns raised their hands, unwilling to face federal officers in addition to Thomas and the women. Morrison himself stood frozen beside his horse, his face pale with the realization that his carefully constructed deception had collapsed around him. The stolen cattle continued grazing peacefully, oblivious to the human drama that had just played out. "Marshal Crawford," Thomas said, holstering his weapons. "I'm Thomas McKenna. I believe Sheriff Dalton has been looking for me on some serious but false charges." Crawford kept his weapon drawn but pointed at the ground. "Mr. McKenna, you're wanted for cattle rustling. What are you doing here?" "Proving my innocence," Thomas replied, "and exposing the real rustler in the process." Ruth climbed to her feet, shaken but unhurt. "Marshal, you just heard Mr. Morrison confess to stealing cattle and framing innocent ranchers. Those federal witnesses he was so eager to impress heard every word." Crawford looked confused and angry. "What exactly is going on here? Mr. Morrison, you told me this was a routine recovery of stolen livestock." Morrison's composure cracked completely. "These people are criminals! They're working with McKenna to steal my cattle." "Your cattle?" Sarah Garrison stepped into the clearing with her rifle cradled casually in her arms. "Marshal, if you'll examine the brands on these animals, you'll find they belong to at least 6 different ranchers, all of whom supposedly sold out or lost their stock to rustlers in recent months." Maria emerged from her position with the small notebook where she had recorded brand information from their reconnaissance mission. "I have detailed documentation of every brand in that herd, Marshal. Mr. Morrison can't legally own cattle belonging to the Martinez, Wilson, and Rodriguez families." Crawford's expression grew increasingly grim as he began to understand the scope of what he had stumbled into. "Sheriff Dalton, were you aware that these cattle belong to multiple owners?" Dalton's face had gone pale as he realized his cooperation with Morrison was about to be exposed. "Mr. Morrison assured me they were recovered stolen stock." "They are stolen stock," Kate called out from her position in the rocks. "Stolen by Morrison and his men, then blamed on innocent ranchers to cover up the theft." The evidence was overwhelming, and Crawford was experienced enough to recognize when he had walked into a major criminal operation. "Mr. Morrison, you're under arrest for cattle theft, conspiracy, and fraud against the federal government." Morrison made one last desperate attempt to salvage his position. "You can't believe these people. They're known associates of a wanted fugitive." "A fugitive you framed to cover up your own crimes," Thomas said quietly. "Marshal, if you examine the brands carefully and compare them to territorial records, you'll find that every one of these animals belongs to someone other than Morrison." Crawford nodded grimly and began organizing his prisoners. Sheriff Dalton would face charges for corruption and conspiracy. Morrison's surviving gunmen would be held as accessories to theft and attempted murder. Morrison himself would face the full weight of federal prosecution for his elaborate rustling operation. As the sun began to set over the Texas hills, Thomas McKenna found himself a free man for the first time in over a week. The charges against him would be dropped once the territorial court reviewed the evidence of Morrison's frame-up. More importantly, the small ranchers of the county would finally be free from the intimidation and theft that had plagued them for months. Ruth Thompson sat on a boulder beside the waterhole, cleaning a scrape on her arm where she had hit the ground during the gunfight. Despite the danger she had faced, her expression was one of deep satisfaction. "About time someone stood up to that bunch of thieves." Sarah Garrison helped Marshal Crawford organize the captured cattle for return to their rightful owners. The complex process of sorting out ownership would take weeks, but at least the stolen stock would go back where it belonged instead of disappearing into the northern markets. Kate Williams emerged from the rocks with her rifle slung over her shoulder and a slight smile on her weathered face. Well, that was more excitement than we've had since we started this ranch. Maria Santos laughed as she packed away her notebook full of evidence. Speak for yourself. I thought Ruth was going to get herself shot playing innocent traveler. Thomas looked around at the 4 remarkable women who had risked everything to help a fugitive prove his innocence. They had shown more courage and determination than most men he knew, and they had never wavered in their commitment to seeing justice done. Ladies, he said quietly, I owe you more than I can ever repay. You saved my life and helped expose a criminal operation that was destroying honest ranchers throughout this county. Sarah smiled and adjusted her hat against the setting sun. Just glad we could help set things right. This county will be a better place with Morrison behind bars. As they prepared for the ride back to the Double Bar Ranch, Thomas realized that his life had been changed in more ways than just clearing his name. He had found something among these determined women that he had been missing for years, a sense of belonging and purpose that went beyond just working cattle and earning wages. The clotheslines where he had first hidden still waited at the ranch, but Thomas McKenna was no longer a man running from false charges. He was a man who had found his place among people who valued courage, justice, and the willingness to stand up for what was right. The Texas sky painted itself in shades of gold and crimson as the riders headed home, their mission complete and their future bright with possibilities they had earned through determination and shared courage.